After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. Happy 4th of July! On the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence, in a heatwave delayed by storms, Donald Trump gave a very Donald Trump speech.
Communism is a loser, and it always will be. America is a nation of winners, and today our country is winning again, and we're winning like never before. So you look at Venezuela, you look at Iran, we wiped it out, and this is a flag that's the banner of the most extraordinary, most exceptional, most incredible nation ever to exist on the face of the earth.
And white supremacists marched through the streets of Washington, D.C. So, going pretty much as you'd expect at this point. But as the midterm elections approach, we don't really know what to expect next in America, even if many pundits like to insist they do. Back with us to talk about what we do know and what we don't is Dr. Emma Shortis.
Hi, Angus.
I was talking to Alan off air last week about his trip to Portugal and how much port he drank and then proceeded to bring back. You have just been in Belgium and Germany, whereas I spent the weekend on a replacement bus at Nerang railway station on the Gold Coast. Life isn't fair, mate.
Nah, it's pretty much the same things.
Yeah, I guess. Before we get into it, on Belgium, we talked a couple of weeks ago about how FIFA, the organisers of this World Cup, imported the US's broken ticketing system and to charge $1 gasquillion dollars for tickets. Turns out they might be importing their system of presidential pardons as well, because FIFA, after lobbying from the White House, has reportedly overturned a suspension to one of the US men's national team players. That's not really something that happens, but it happened. And Belgium, their upcoming opponent, is filthy, I think it's fair to say.
I mean, not unreasonably. Hey, no. I mean, yet another case of Trump not caring about things that matter to the Europeans and breaking any norms that are left.
So you are back from a work trip, less port for you than Alan's experience, I think. But
unfortunately.
How was the trip? Tell us about it.
The trip was fantastic. I don't recommend going to Brussels or Berlin in a record-breaking heat wave.
No.
The Europeans are not prepared for that kind of weather. It was appalling and like a little bit scary, when all of your infrastructure is set up to keep heat in and then it's over 40 degrees. That's pretty gross. But aside from that, it was a wonderful trip. So it was with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is the German think tank attached to the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party. And we were meeting with our European and German colleagues to talk about security broadly, but specifically to talk about our relationships with China. So the remit of the FES is to strengthen networks and relationships between Australia and Europe and Australia and Germany, specifically when it comes to China. So it was like a fascinating week. It was really full on. We talked to so many people from the European Union institutions like the European Commission, from the European Parliament, and then in Germany in places like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, trade union peak bodies, industry peak bodies. So it was quite the whirlwind. And I think probably the biggest thing to come out of it for me was our shared problems, democracy's shared problems with not just kind of grappling with what Trump is doing, but in being able to create a vision for something different rather than just being reactive, actually articulating what kind of world it is we want and doing the work to implement that world. It was really striking, particularly in Germany, the similarities with the current Australian government and that wish to kind of just like approach issues managerially or technocratically rather than doing the structural work, and particularly the structural investment, like actually paying for the reform that is needed. So that was really striking. There are, of course, pretty dramatic differences as well. Like Germany's relationship with China is radically different to Australia's. Their preoccupations around security are quite different. I know you talked about that with Alan, particularly around Russia, but we heard a lot, particularly about China's relationship with Russia, an issue that just doesn't really come up in Australia. So that was, I guess, a long way of saying that, it was amazing. It was lovely not thinking about Trump directly for over a week, and, also drinking not quite Alan levels of beer, but pretty close.
Yeah.
And I did also, I just wanted to say that I caught up with a very dear friend in Berlin, Tanya, who is a long-time pod listener. So shout out to our one German-based listener.
Yeah, and may there be many more. I do note for listeners that your concerns about European governments not being willing to pay for things spiked when your train from Berlin to Munich got cancelled and you had to spend a 4.5-hour trip on a replacement train standing up.
Like all of my deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about Germany just shattered by one train trip where I paid over 100 euros for a train trip in which I sat on the floor for like 5 hours.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah.
We're not going to let that colour our whole trip. We're not going to do that international relations thing where we have one bad experience and equate it with the entire country.
Yeah.
But, also Europe is dying.
I'll save my Elon joke then for later. This isn't going to be a super Trumpy pod, but I did want to, I guess, pick up on the issue of the US and how the people you met with in Germany and in Belgium were, I guess, thinking about the Trump administration and the challenges that poses.
So this was one of the most interesting aspects for me. Like I want to couch it in, this was a select group of people that we met, and we were there mostly to talk about China and relationships with China and, how we're approaching that or how we could approach that differently. So a lot of the people we spoke to were working very, very specifically on China and particularly in that bureaucratic way, were very focused on kind of staying in their lane. Having said that, though, it was really fascinating to me how little America did come up. Like often it came up because I brought it up, because I wanted to know how that was playing into their thinking. And
so your Trump derangement syndrome kicking in.
That's me. Just read the Instagram comments. It was striking how kind of not dismissive, like certainly not in a rude way, but like the response to that often was kind of like, yeah, like that's a thing that's happening, and we've kind of moved on. Like we're thinking about this now, which was, deeply refreshing, and often felt like one of the examples I often used, of course, was our Australia Institute polling around people's understanding of the United States as a reliable ally and how that's tanked. Which matches similar polling in Europe. And, my European colleagues would be kind of like, well, yeah, obviously. But we're still, in Australia, I think we're still kind of getting our heads around that. So that was refreshing and really interesting. But again, it's not universal. Like that's certainly, I think, not how the Secretary General of NATO, who famously called Trump daddy, is thinking about the United States, but it felt like a significant difference from conversations in Australia.
Yeah, okay. Well, in this episode, let's stay away from Trump, at least directly. I want to talk about the midterms because there are some primaries going on at the moment. And I also want to think forward a little bit to the presidential election in a couple of years' time. So let's start with the midterms. Trump and I guess US democracy faces its first big test in November with the congressional midterm elections, first big test since Trump was elected for the second time. That's still ages away, but there's been a lot of focus on it because of some big Supreme Court interventions into voting rights, which we've talked about on the show before, and because the primaries are underway. Before we get into that detail, can you just explain for those of us who aren't as deep into the detail as you are, like what the midterms are and sort of what they mean?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is something I have to remind myself of every 2 years as well, how this kind of clunky system works. But basically, congressional elections are held every 2 years. So they fall on presidential elections and then halfway through a presidential term. And that was set up deliberately, really, as a check on the power of the presidency, as one of those checks and balances. It means that the House of Representatives, they only serve 2-year terms, which is kind of ridiculous because you basically get elected and then you're campaigning again, kind of within months, really.
Particularly in the US system where money is like everything, right?
Yeah,
Not
exactly
everything, but
right,
a
where
lot.
you're continually having to fundraise.
Yeah.
And all of them have to do it. So all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for election, and a third of the 100-seat Senate is also up for election. And just to clarify, because people don't always know this, which is completely reasonable, the House of Representatives and the Senate together equal Congress. So when people are talking about Congress, it's the way that we kind of talk about Parliament, meaning the House of Reps and the Senate together.
Yeah. I imagine, like in Australia, most people think instinctively about the House of Reps and sort of forget about the Senate, but it applies to both.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. When, arguably, at least for the moment in the US system, the Senate is where it all happens because that's where power is so closely divided. There's a majority of kind of one or two most of the time. And so that's really hard fought because that's where everything stops. And that's where things like Supreme Court justices are confirmed as well. Yeah. So the Senate has enormous influence over the shape of American politics. So, there's a lot at stake in these elections. And they're generally in a kind of crude way seen as a referendum on a presidency, a referendum on the first 2 years. I've also seen them described not so much as a referendum, but like a fairly predictable backlash, against an administration. So you would normally, emphasis on normally, expect that the oppositional party, so the party that doesn't hold the presidency, will usually kind of win the midterm elections, particularly in the House of Representatives. So you'll see, in this presidency, particularly when the president is so deeply unpopular, you would expect to see a quote unquote blue wave. So Democrats sweeping the House. And given how bad Trump's polling numbers are, potentially even taking back the Senate, which is more unusual.
Yeah.
Right. But so that's what we would, all things being equal, that's what we would expect. But, as we always say, all things are not equal, and the Republicans are doing everything they can to stop that from happening, and are making noises about wanting to hold on to the House and the Senate at these elections in November.
Yeah. I mean, I want a pony. Lots of people want lots of things, I guess. Okay, so the primaries are underway, and that's where voters basically choose who they want to stand for an election, which is quite different to the Australian system. So it's the election before the election. What's been going on in the primaries? Where are they at, and what do the results so far tell us?
So the primary elections, which loosely the similarity is to the pre-selection process in Australia, where the internal decisions are made in parties about who stands. That's a much more open process in the United States, where people who are registered with parties, and sometimes people who aren't, depending on the system, can vote for those candidates. And in some ways, given how gerrymandered the United States electoral map is, the primaries are kind of more important than the actual elections themselves, because that's kind of decides in the overwhelming majority of districts, that decides who's going to be the representatives.
And that's because the many of the districts are so clearly geared to be either Republican or Democrat. Is that right? Like it's very unlikely that the other party is going to win. It's about which member of the party that is the favourite gets to run.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the analysis changes a little bit depending on who you're reading, but the rough consensus is that less than 30 of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives are considered toss-up seats. So they could go either way, and only 16 kind of lean one way or the other, like might be toss-ups. I suspect that might be worse since that redistricting process. I think, I've tried to figure out how that's going to affect the electoral map, but I don't think anybody quite knows yet.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's so interesting when you compare it to the Australian experience of recent years, in particular, like one of the things our researchers at the Institute say is there's no such thing as a safe seat in Australia. And that's because we've seen really wild swings in formally safe seats, where this is particularly true in Liberal Party heartland in Sydney and Melbourne, where the Liberal Party would have had huge majorities and then they've gone to independence or whatever. And that's partly based on our preferential voting system, right?
Yeah, and I think that is one of the key differences. There have been some efforts to bring in preferential voting into some systems. So there's preferential voting in Alaska, for example, which has created all kinds of course, all kinds of conspiracy theories. But on balance, yes, it's kind of a choice between two parties, and in lots of electorates, it's not even that. It's so gerrymandered that it's pretty much guaranteed that one or the other party will win, depending on the lay of the map. And so what that does is make those kind of internal ideological fights within the party really quite dramatic and also quite public. The primaries in particular become fights for the soul of both parties. They become fights for the ideological makeup of the parties. And particularly amongst the Democrats, it encourages this weird kind of political punditry, particularly in the presidential primaries, where Democrats voting in the primaries are kind of fall into this trap of trying to think desperately about who other Democrats would like to vote for, particularly Democrats in like rural or urban America. So you have, New York-based Democratic pundits continually saying like, we can't go too far left, we can't be too socialist because Democrats in like, I don't know, Ohio or Utah aren't going to vote for that kind of politics. And so it becomes a particularly bitter fight really for the soul of the Democratic Party. And we can see that playing out in the primaries already.
Yeah, okay. So tell us about some of the kind of key races that you've been keeping your eye on.
Sure. So there's some pretty interesting ones. There's been a lot of attention on Texas and particularly the Senate race in Texas. So that state has long been somewhere that Democrats aspire to winning because there are Democratic strongholds in, Houston, which is hugely diverse and a little kind of Democratic little blue island in a sea of red. And Democrats there in Texas have long been crying out to the kind of broader party to say, like, if you actually pay attention to Texas, if you do the ground game, then this is a winnable state. These are winnable places. And there's been a lot of focus on Texas this time around because the Democratic candidate for the Senate there, James Tallarico, is hugely popular in the Democratic Party. He's an excellent communicator. He's a Presbyterian minister, so has the kind of, I guess, Christian credentials that you need in a place like Texas. But he's also really staunch in his political positions, and in a place like Texas, that's not guaranteed, right? To go back to what I was saying about political punditry, the focus of that kind of quote unquote analysis is often about Democrats being too woke and focusing too much, particularly on issues of trans rights, and the argument is, of course, that, this doesn't appeal to mainstream America or whatever. Tallarico is really shaking up that position. And I got a lot of these actually from a Fox News article that was attacking Tallarico for his controversial stances. But perhaps his most famous quote, and the one that Fox News trots out all the time, is that God is non-binary. And he's also said that trans children are God's children, made in God's own image. And, is unchanging on this, no matter how much pressure he seems to come under. He's even said, like, the only thing that the media wants to ask me about are trans athletes. And this has been an issue in Texas because Texas Republicans have been passing some just egregious laws around trans people. But Tallarico kind of pushes back on that and says that the only minority destroying this country is the billionaires. And so they're kind of Mamdani-esque lines, slightly kind of with a Texan slant, I guess. He's also been on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's been on Ezra Klein's podcast. He's doing all the rounds. And I mean, he certainly has the moral high ground over his opponent, who's a Trump-backed Republican, an original kind of Tea Partier called Ken Paxton, who's the Texas Attorney General, and who the media describes as scandal-plagued.
Yeah. I'm assuming Tallarico didn't smoke weed on Rogan like Elon did that time.
I mean, I don't know. I don't listen to 4 hours of Joe Rogan.
It's 4 hours. Jeez, I don't know who has time. I mean, good on you if you do. But. So there's also been some interesting stuff because we've talked a little bit on the show before about Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist mayor of New York, and I guess his success and what that is telling the Democratic Party.
Tomorrow, our nation marks 250 years since we declared our independence. 250 years of a grand experiment in self-governance, an experiment so audacious that some in 1776 doubted it would last more than a few years. The truth, my friends, is that America is exceptional because here, nothing is fixed into place. The frontier may be closed, we may have walked on the moon, but the work of fulfilling the values first enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, that work endures, and it belongs to us all.
And we've seen some sort of Mamdani-linked, Mamdani-backed candidates in the primaries. What's been happening there?
Yeah, sure. So Mamdani's seeing huge success in New York, not just in his role as mayor, but also as a kind of power broker now, particularly in the Democratic Party in New York. So the kind of AOC Mamdani gauntlet, I guess, is it has seen 3 primary race winners, all kind of, as you said, Mamdani-linked, Mamdani-backed candidates who have unseated in the primaries long-time Democratic candidates, in some cases like a decade-long. Very senior members of the Democratic Party have been unseated by young Democratic socialists backed by Mamdani. So, all the media reportage is about how this is sending, or I guess whether this is sending a national message to the Democratic Party. Certainly establishment, older Democrats, particularly that kind of conservative New York, very accustomed to power Democratic Party are deeply unhappy about this and what it might mean. But Mamdani is certainly framing it as a, sending a national message about, kind of like getting shit done, having a vision, being able to communicate and do so with joy, really, offering that alternative to Trump's vision of America. And, Mamdani is so explicit about this. So he gave us a speech on the 4th of July before Trump's first speech about, the United States' proud and deep history of being an immigrant nation. So the contrast could not be starker. And this is a kind of where I think that battle, or I guess the center is of that battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. And Republicans, of course, are, seeking to exploit this. There's a reason that Donald Trump was talking about communists in his one of his 4th of July speech.
Our warriors did not fight communism on battlefields across the world, only to have that menace rear its ugly head right back here in America. We're not going to let it happen. We'd like to stop a threat like that immediately and before it begins. It's like a cancer. You got to cut it out. You got to cut it out fast.
We can expect to see a fair bit more of that in the coming months, I think.
Yeah.
And I also just wanted to mention there is one other race that I've been watching fairly closely, and I'm certainly not alone in that, and that's in Maine, the Senate race in Maine, where Graham Plattner, who's a Bernie Sanders-backed candidate, is attempting to unseat Republican Susan Collins, who's one of those like perpetually concerned Republicans who occasionally pushes back on Trump, but like not really. So someone who should be gettable in a fairly kind of, Maine's a weird political beast, but it's certainly not like a Tea Party Trump Republican stronghold. Like that's not what Susan Collins is. Yeah. But Democrats in the primaries have elected Plattner, who is also someone you might describe as scandal-plagued.
Yeah. There's a bit of that going around. In the Oval Office,
including having not anymore, but having had a Nazi tattoo. which I actually like, I won't go into now, but I did have a long conversation about this with Chaz Licciardello on PEP. So maybe we can link that in the show notes rather than kind of going into it in great detail. But Plattner will be a really interesting one because he is the kind of like platonic ideal of a left-wing working class white dude candidate, the kind of, you know, all those people are like, we need a Joe Rogan of the left. Like we need somebody who's going to appeal to the working class and win back the Rust Belt. This guy is like, you know, you couldn't dream up a better version of that. He's a veteran. He's like ruggedly handsome. He's an oyster farmer. You know, he also has a Nazi tattoo, but like,
he claimed that he didn't know what it meant. And did he get it removed?
Yeah, he got it covered up far too late.
Okay.
So, and this is what I mean kind of about the punditry as well, that like there was so much talk on the like podcast circuit about how he's the perfect candidate and like you guys are too woke, you're too, you know, no one's perfect, blah, blah, blah. But as it kind of falls out, like it's early, but in polling at the moment, he's splitting about even with Collins. So it's not, I mean, it doesn't appear at least initially that it's going to be this like Mamdani like wave in Maine where, I mean, arguably, like I said, Maine is weird, but like it should be because Collins is so kind of meh and nothing and it's been there for ages.
Yeah, okay.
So, you know, all these battles are still playing out. Like there's this huge fight over narrative and what it will mean. And the primaries aren't over. So they're ongoing really till mid-September. So by then, and again, all things being equal after the midterm elections, we will probably have a clearer idea of where things are falling in the Democratic Party. We know where they are in the Republican Party. Trump has control.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty to keep an eye on over the next few months. It'd be really interesting to see. Now, I did say at the top of the show that we'll talk about the impending presidential race as well. But we've had too good a time talking about the midterm, so maybe we'll pick that up.
I had a week off and now then I had too much to say.
You've got lots of things. So we might pick that up again in a future episode and talk about what particularly the Democratic field is going to look like and, you know, if there's going to be a Republican field. We'll see. But just to finish up, you say all the time that this is not a normal election cycle and we can't treat it as one. So have we just like wasted our time? Did we fall into a trap? Or are we hysterical, Emma?
I mean, can both be true?
Yes.
I mean, I can definitely be, I am, I think, often like fairly hysterical about it, but I think that's like an evidence-based hysteria.
Is that a contradiction in terms?
I don't know. You know, I think we have to be comfortable with that. You know, things are such a mess in the United States. Friend of the show, Don Watson, gave a lecture in Melbourne on Saturday night on the 4th of July, which will actually be broadcast at some point on RN. So when it is, we can chuck a link in the show notes because it
Radio National for all the not old people.
Oh, sorry. On the ABC. And Don was talking about the way in which Trump has unraveled the bindings that have held the United States together, and that has been evident on July 4, you know, the way that he has kind of hijacked the rhetoric and the narrative of the United States.
Even the organization of the celebrations, right? He created
exactly
a sort of counterforce to organize a less woke 250th.
Just wild. It's so disgusting. But I guess that's a way of saying, and Don said this too, that, you know, that probably can't be pulled back together, like at least not in the way that it was held together. If something comes out of this, it will be something different. You know, it will be a different version of the United States, which is really teetering on the brink. You started this by talking about how the midterm elections are a huge test for American democracy, and that's true. And it's not clear that it will pass that test. You know, I think on the balance of things, it's more likely that it won't, which is not a prediction at all. Like I certainly wouldn't attempt to predict what's going to happen. I don't think anybody can. Things are so messy. But what I am certain about is that we can't treat this as a normal election cycle. And it is astonishing to me how much, particularly the Australian media, wants to do that. A little while ago, I did quite a long interview with a mainstream Australian outlet about the midterms, and I talked about this. Like, I talked about the not normal, talked about the Supreme Court, blah, 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 blah. And then the final piece came out, which was a long form, like, midterms explainer. And, my joke about, like, how do you tell who's running for president, who's written a book, like, that got in quite a lot of detail. And there was, in this huge piece, like, which would have run kind of over 1,000, maybe 2,000 words, there was one sentence about, like, Supreme Court controversy.
Yeah.
And, like, that, to me, that is such a distortion of the current reality in the United States. And, like, really, to circle back, that was one of the other huge differences between conversations I have in Australia and conversations I have in Europe. Like, my European colleagues were astonished when I said, that in Australia there seems to be this kind of expectation that the midterms will right things, or 2028 will right things and things will go back to normal. Like, I just kind of got these quizzical eyebrows from Europeans being like, what? That's weird.
Yeah.
And it is. Like, the evidence is so clear. Like, Trump keeps telling us he's not going to accept an election loss. Why would we think he,
And we do seem to have a remarkable ability to continue to be surprised about what this guy does. Yeah. Well, on that note, Emma, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you back.
Thanks, Angus. Great to be back.
We'll be back with another episode next week. If you'd like to get in contact about the show today, you can reach us at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday the 6th of June, and After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.